I guess our cross chat is a signal that we're starting, I think.
Yeah, we're beginning.
We're going to cross chatting. I guess we'll be done cross chatting with each other
We
now.
thought we'd start by introducing ourselves. We don't have a moderator, so this is a conversation about mothering while the world burns, which is a fun topic. But
It is. It is. And apt, which is even more fun.
Well, very apt.
Yeah.
I mean, so I'm Emily Raboteau. I'm very happy to be here.
And I'm Lydia Millet, and I'm seated in the throne, so I feel very special.
I'm Ayana Mathis, and that's it. I don't have a fun fact.
Well, we were both too intimidated to sit in the throne, so we're grateful to Lydia for taking the throne.
Indeed. She's the golden girl, the golden woman of the hour.
Or the venerable dowager.
Whichever way you want to play it.
Thanks.
We can certainly get into how mothering while the world burns relates as a topic to our work, but I thought I would just share that yesterday, 2 out of the 3 of us were on a wonderful boat tour on a catamaran yesterday. It was a gorgeous day, and yet also we were very aware of the fires burning in Los Angeles, having friends and loved ones losing homes, and I had just been rereading a children's Bible, Lydia's wonderful book that if you don't know, you have a wonderful treat to look forward to. And as it turns out, Ayana was also rereading the book in anticipation of today's conversation. And I was telling Lydia, we're sitting at the prow. Is that the front of the boat? I don't have
It could
sailing.
be the prow. That sounds really old-fashioned. Maybe just the bow, but I like
We're sitting
prow.
at the bow, at the front of the boat. Gorgeous, windy, beautiful waves. And I said to Lydia, I feel kind of like the parents in your book in this story about intergenerational trauma related to the climate crisis. So it's not a plot spoiler, I hope, but you have these children and you have their parents who are, I would describe as being irresponsible insofar as they're on vacation with their kids, they're not really talking about the climate crisis at all. And the kids know what's coming and they have this disdain, an understandable disdain for their parents for being so silent about this, as they're basically just day drinking, flirting with each other. And here we were, some of us on this boat, day drinking. I don't know if there was flirtation going on. There might have been. But this cognitive dissonance is something I'm really interested in personally as a writer, this desire to enjoy, to be alive, also as a parent, for my children to thrive, to enjoy life, to be able to access Key West and at the same time feeling all the myriad feelings of guilt and rage and confusion and grief about the world burning. It is an apt title. We didn't know when this title was given to the panel that those fires would be raging so extremely. But
Yeah, there is a strange detachment that we all sometimes have, I think, partly geographical, where we have the surfeit of information. There's just so much information and visual information and sound and, of course, words, language coming in about crises and atrocities happening everywhere. But we can be sitting, on the balcony of a beautiful hotel somewhere, like the Marquesa or something, or on this catamaran, and just feel this powerlessness, this separation from all these sites of crises, that we have so much information about, this unprecedented amount of information.
I think this is something I think about all the time. I describe it differently. Sometimes I describe it as feeling as though the world is kind of schizophrenic. Sometimes I describe it as like walking around in these states of unreality, which I'm doing too, right? Like I'm always kind of like, I'm gonna get new shoes and I'll get, get my nails done. But at the same time that I'm completely aware, as we all are, of all of this stuff that is constantly happening. And I would add probably that we know in the back of our minds, however much we're able to deal with it, that soon it's gonna happen to us, right? Like it's not just that it's going to keep happening to others, which is painful enough to watch, but like it's coming. And there's that really, it's a bizarre thing to try to kind of carry around with you. And it's a bizarre thing, I think, also particularly as a writer, because part of the job is to write into reality at the same time that I'm living often in an unreality with like my shoes and what am I gonna have for dinner and, you know, going to beautiful places and all of that. So it presents, I feel like sometimes it presents a dilemma both as like a person, but particularly kind of as a writer in a certain way.
Can I ask you a question, Ayana? So Lydia and I write explicitly about climate change in our work. Lydia in both fiction and nonfiction, myself mostly in essays so far. You have a newish book out called The Unsettled, which if folks don't know, they also have a treat to look forward to. Second novel. First novel is The 12 Tribes of Hattie, and both novels feature, I would say, difficult mothers. And since our topic is mothers, but also the world burning, one thing you and I have talked about is how the climate crisis is not the first existential threat. One thing I really love about the second book, The Unsettled, is much of it takes place in Philadelphia, and there is a sort of, I was going to say fictionalized version of Move. It's not fictionalized, it's sort of like a slipstream reality. There is a destructive thing that happens to a utopian community, which you can address more, Ayana, but a utopian community is destroyed in a horrible way. There are children involved. It's a, I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about parenting in your work, parenting through existential crises that are not the climate crises, and what lessons there are to learn perhaps about futurity from your own work. We were talking a little bit about an idea that Toni Morrison has talked about too in regards to mothering and the threats posed to mothering itself in the Black community.
Yeah. So I think, and this is also something that I wanted to ask you about, Emily, both of you about it. In Emily's book, Lessons for Survival, which is a collection, so it's nonfiction, as she was saying. She visits a native community far, far, far north in Alaska, and they also talk about, you know, well, this isn't the first, you know, but that's something I actually want to ask both of you. But I think that in this moment, you know, we're sort of facing a crisis. All the words feel inadequate, you know, unprecedented, etc. You know, that's all those words, you know. But that's true. I'm not discounting the fact that that's true. But it is also the case that for many, many communities, wholesale disaster to the level of sort of destroying everything you are, everything you want to pass on to your children, both in terms of knowledge or in terms of material things like land, in terms of heritage. There are many communities around the world that have faced these kinds of things over and over and over again. So for many people, the current crisis, while the dimensions are different, and certainly it's kind of totalizing, it's not exactly the first time that one has encountered, you know, an idea of being wiped out or being completely destroyed. So that's an interesting kind of thing. I think in my books, both of them, I make a joke that as Emily alluded to, that I'm sort of always writing about failed mothers. And both of the principal mother figures in my book are kind of larger than life women who are a little bit difficult to love sometimes, and who love their children very deeply, but who make very strange choices about how to care for them sometimes. Sometimes they are just plain old mistakes, like they're just really doing the wrong thing. But other times, the fact is that the dimensions of their mothering look different. And they look differently because, and these are Black characters that I'm writing about, and particularly generally poor Black characters. You know, we live in a society in which the notion of Black motherhood has always been kind of compromised But if we go back, obviously, to sort of the slave period, black women were not mothers. They were barely considered women. They were producers of product. So their children were not children. Their children were product. They had no rights of parenting in any of the usual ways we think of the rights of parenthood or what that means. They had none of the guarantees of parenthood. That is, my children will stay with me until however long they are with me. So none of that. So what happens, this is what Emily was alluding to, like sort of what happens in a culture writ large and within the community itself when the basic sense of what a mother is or can be has been denied. So what we know is that black families have found tremendously, I hate words like resilience, but I'm gonna use it sadly, like resilient in finding ways to make family and to love each other. But this basic concept of what a mother is looks differently and is enacted differently and is no less legitimate, certainly, than what has been held up as legitimate, which is like a nuclear, kind of man, woman, white, often middle-class family, being sort of held up as the norm or what is wholesome or what is good. And these families are often operating completely outside of those norms and doing something completely different. No less legitimate, obviously. But one of the things that I've always been interested in is trying to think about what does love look like in these contexts that, even the words I'm using, alternative, but I'm like, alternative to what? Like I'm presuming a norm when I even say alternative, but what does love look like in various different kinds of contexts and configurations of family? And that's really been one of the things that I think I have thought a lot about in my work.
I was glad you brought up Toni Morrison when we were kind of spitballing ahead of this because, of course, in Beloved, which I hope everybody in the room has already read, love might look like killing a child so that they aren't
taken back into slavery.
Yeah. So these kinds of questions that are posed to those of us who are mothering or thinking about intergenerational justice in light of the climate crisis are also really large and scary. What is the future going to be for my children, my grandchildren? Lydia, maybe you could talk a little bit about intergenerational justice in intergenerational trauma as it plays out in your own work. And of course, your most recent work is nonfiction. If I'm not mistaken, is it your first work of a book of nonfiction?
Yeah.
Why did you reach for that mode, like now?
Yeah, I'm very curious about that too.
Thanks for asking. So in A Children's Bible, I'd written from, more or less from the point of view of people the age of my daughter, say, and my son, around in there, so like teens at the time that I wrote it. And they were, as Emily said, full of rage toward their parents. The parents are sort of debauched and sort of overprivileged and not able to really engage with reality, I guess. But I wrote it because partly I wanted to write about anger, the anger of people my children's age against people my age, and previous generations, also still alive generations, over this matter of despoiling the earth, and I didn't see where, when it came to climate fear and anxiety, where that anger part had been written about. And so I wanted to do that, and it's always really delectable to me to write about, rudeness and disregard, and I just love it. I love writing about meanness and, flawed, just egregiously, clearly flawed people. Sometimes subtly, but more often egregiously. So that was what I was doing with this book, and really the parents are indicted, in this book.
It's also funny, and I wonder if at some point in your answer you can. We were talking about this actually, Emily and I.
Apocalyptic fiction doesn't tend to be funny. It was just thinking about The Road. another great book. That's really not funny.
The least
Whereas
funny book
your
ever.
book is so funny.
Well, I'm glad. Thank you for that. I mean, I don't often write without any intention to be funny. I may fail in my intent to be funny occasionally, but there's always some thing about writing where I want to make my own self laugh as I'm doing it, and also actually cry. And even though that sounds sentimental, but I do like to just be really moved when I write. So yeah, so that was also a thing I was trying to do with this book. Before, in many previous books, I'd sort of had sort of satirical, broad books that were more toward funny, and then I'd had kind of quieter, more meditative, or sort of idea-based books, more solemn books. And I wanted to try to marry the two. So I wanted to be writing about sort of vast and unspeakable things, but also have a few jokes. So anyway, I had another novel came after that called Dinosaurs, and then but throughout it all, I was writing this other book that just came out this year, which is sort of a memoir, only it's not primarily about myself. It's about this generalized situation in which we all find ourselves
It's called an anti-memoir.
Someone called it that, but I didn't. I mean, a very kind person called it that, but it's not sort of rebellious or like punk enough, I think, to be fairly called anti-memoir. I mean, but in this book, I was sort of writing fairly earnestly from the point of view of the parents I had so maligned in a children's Bible. I was trying to reclaim a little space for those of us who are sinners and have sinned, against these younger generations. And so that was sort of my impulse to sort of say, yes, and we do wrong every day, but that is what it is to be us and to be human, and also what is the emotional, what is the affect and the subjectivity of those of us who err so egregiously against our children. So,
I wonder if I could. I have a thought and two questions. And the thought is that I'm slightly sentimental thought, but that I'm just sort of very grateful to be sitting here with the two of you because there's such different perspectives being brought to bear on the same things. And that's very important. And it seems particularly important. When you were asking, we were talking about Toni Morrison, and we were and so sort of talking about slavery and talking about women as chattel or their children as product. And I think one of the reasons I'm grateful to be sitting here is because it is very easy for us to sort of separate out parts of history and be like, that part of history belongs to those people, and this other parts of history belongs to these people. And that doesn't have anything to do with me, or that doesn't have anything to do with now. And one of the difficulties I think that I've been having lately, often when I'm in panels or speaking publicly, is sometimes my own resistance to thinking holistically and the general kind of climate and public imagination's resistance to holistic thinking. Because chattel slavery and children as product is on the same road that leads us to the fires in Los Angeles, right? Like this is all a nexus of things. Yeah. And when we keep separating them out, I think it's how we always end up sort of wandering down these separate roads, and we end up with fires in Los Angeles, and displacement far and wide, because we can't integrate the things that we are that are good, certainly, and we certainly can't integrate the things that we are that are bad, and we can't integrate the past. And that seems to me to be almost one of our biggest problems, and one of the things that I think often makes me have that schizophrenic, unreality kind of feeling. So that's gratitude. That's for being here and for being up here with you two, who we're all coming at these things in such different ways. And then the questions. It's sort of the same question for both of you, but very different. I was thinking, I alluded earlier, Emily, to the chapter or to the essay, rather, in Lessons for Survival, in which I always forget, they're the salmon people, I always forget their proper name,
Yupik?
I forget their name.
Yupik.
Kupik, yes. So I wondered if you could just sort of talk about that in the context of sort of like nurturance. And then for you, I wondered if you could talk about, I mean, obviously it's a very different context, but I wondered if you could talk about nurturance too. When I was thinking about it in the children's Bible, the parents kind of abdicate, right? But the children nurture one another. Mm-hmm. They nurture the place that they've been given to steward.
Animals.
And animals. And so, yeah, I just wondered if y'all could each talk about that in your different ways.
Sure. Thanks for your expression of gratitude and alluding to the straight line between, or rather the condition that we're in, of one that puts profit above life, human life, and other than human life. It's hard even to have a conversation or think about the fires in LA without also talking about the fact that 30% of the firefighters are incarcerated, right?
30%.
To be part of the conversation. Was that their choice? Really?
Yeah.
The essay that you're referring to, which comes toward the end of my collection of essays, is called Gut Bucket. And it's actually about personal and planetary loss. I lost my father. He had Lewy body dementia, and I was grieving over the loss of him. We were talking on the boat about parents dying of dementia, actually. Which is a terrible kind of slow loss, right? Because you lose the person you knew before their body even expires. Was dealing with that loss and thinking about planetary loss on these levels we're discussing. And I had the opportunity to go to the Arctic with a colleague of mine. I teach at the City College of New York, which is one of the campuses of the CUNY system. An Earth and atmospheric scientist who's funded by NASA to study the Arctic from space with satellite technology. And she wanted to bring me along because I'd been writing about the climate crisis from humanistic level. And she said, I'd really love you to talk to the local community, Yupik native population, this one particular village that she's been collecting water samples and looking at from space for years now. She wanted to know what their perspectives were on changes to the water and the land, and brought me along to talk to them. And I had the opportunity to interview several elders from that community. And these elders, many of them had been sent to these Indian schools to beat the Indian out of the child, had their hair shorn. These schools where some children were beaten to death and to have their culture taken away, their language, and yet they hadn't been destroyed by that. So when we're talking about, communities who faced existential threat and still here, I think with deep respect and humility, I wanted to know. And I told them, I said, look, I am the mother of black children in New York City, which is threatened in its own way by the climate crisis, by the threat of the rising sea, and also my children are threatened by other intersecting crises. As black boys in the United States, this is who I am, that I have levels of fear that are very large, and I want to know what you can teach me about survival. Mm-hmm. This is my question. And my secondary question was, how have you not died of rage?
Yeah.
What do you do with your anger? And one man who told me his Yupik name, Kiturauria, he said, well, that's easy. We take care of each other. And coming from anybody else's mouth, that would have sounded very trite to me. Mm-hmm. But we had been speaking at great lengths about how he had come through the experience of being robbed of his family and his language and his culture from like at 11 years old to 18, he was in one of these schools where he was mistreated. And he was able to return, reacquire lost language, and it wasn't as if there wasn't insurmountable loss. The very homes are sinking falling into the river, the Yukon, because the permafrost is going, the salmon are gone, right? The levels of loss, because that part of the world is warming twice as fast, are astonishing. And we had talked about like the loss of the animals, the changes to the hunting and gathering ways, and the fact that it's not even possible any longer not to rely on government food being brought in because of all these losses, you know, because of a history of putting profit above human life, and life that's not just human. But it was so simple. He said, yeah, we take care of each other. That's the answer. It made me weep when he said that, because I understood it in my heart to be true. Yeah. And you, in answer to Ayana's question?
Oh, well, I loved that essay, actually.
Thank you.
But I was just remembering it, yeah. And the last one, I believe, also really, that has that quote, those who are dead are never gone. They are still present in thickening shadows. They are there in thickening shadow, I think.
It's a poem by a Senegalese poet whose name I'm not recalling at the moment. And yeah, it has to do with our ancestors. Our ancestors are still breathing and they're still among us. And I love that poem too. Yeah, they're there in the thickening shadow.
It's translated from French, I think you said.
Yeah, it's translated from the French.
Senegalese.
Birago Diop, that's
Right.
his name.
Right. Let's see. I mean, I think that one thing I was writing about in this this book that just came out this year, "We Loved It All" is the name of it, was just that,
Which
you
is
know,
a great title.
Oh, thank you, thank you. It was just that mothers or people who take care of other people, any kind of, you know, you can be a mother or not a mother, but if you're in that position of care, caregiving, caretaking, you always, and especially the young, right? But it could be a niece or a nephew, whatever, a friend's child. You're always in this position of how honest to be, the question of how honest to be about the dying of the various systems of the planet. Because you don't want to instill hopelessness and like generalized hopelessness, obviously, in your kids or anyone else's kids. And teachers face this too. I've talked to like my sister teaches and like teenagers in the LA Unified School District, and you know, everyone faces this who deals with the young, like how honest to be, and also, you know, you can't be Pollyanna either, and you don't. So it's this delicate negotiation, which is also one that's been faced by. You know, activists who I work with in my day job in the climate movement, and communicators in climate, and also in other things, by the way, but everything related and adjacent and among itself, energy justice, you know, social justice, all these things are completely interwoven, you know, with the problem of, say, capitalism and, you know. But that question is also constantly faced by communicators within society on climate, right? Is like we have to have hope, and really the only way we can have hope is by acting in some way, right? Like we have to act. That is the thing that gives us hope. Action, not passivity. But also when your kids ask you questions, how do you frame it to sort of lift them into that action instead of squashing them like a, you know, bug.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't think that probably answers, but maybe it sort of generally answers.
No, it does, because it's about nurturance. I mean, I keep thinking about like what is. I do, and yeah, as we're talking about all these sorts of things. She's like, what, "Are you all going to talk about books?" I don't know, sort of, yeah, maybe we'll. But I think actually we are actually, these questions of futurity, you know, like how. And when I think about futurity, you know, I guess we're talking about is hope, right? seems like a complicated question now, right? It's a very complicated question now. Not just, I mean, there's hope in the simple sense that is often received, like, things will, I hope, it'll be sunny tomorrow, or whatever, right? Like these sort of simple ideas about optimism, I guess. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that hope thought of in that way, or futurity thought of in that way, purely in terms of optimism, is just not going to do it. It's just not going to do the job now.
And almost as a substitute, can be a substitute, right, for this. I think hope, you have to construct hope as more like the desire to action, the desire for action, or the will to action, or something like that. Or I don't know, maybe the sort of embodiment of love, right? Like how you make your love manifest in the world, and not in a woo-woo silly way, and like actually trying to protect what is beautiful and good and what you adore, which is not just yourself and your family, but all that sustains them, right? All that makes them who they are, the rest of the world. But yeah, I think that hope is often, it can be like such a cop-out. The word hope can just stand in for, it'll be fine, There's always been
apathy.
Warming, and there's always been extinction, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Apathy,
I have a friend who was in the Navy who says hope is not a plan.
Yes.
And I think often in the climate space, hope and despair are these two poles, these two words that get used a lot. Like, we can't despair, but and what gives you hope? And when I was on book tour for Lessons for Survival, I was asked a lot in interviews, like on the radio, but what gives you hope? And in particular, how do you give your children hope? At a certain point, the question began to rankle me because I felt it wasn't nuanced enough. Because of what you're saying, hope, if it's not interwoven, like interlaced with anger, which is another word you used in relation to the children's Bible, like you wanted to write about anger. Anger I find to be a very motivating emotion. Mm-hmm. And in terms of talking about it with kids, I think having an arsenal of a lot of words to reach from, is it brings up so many emotions and feelings. There's this climate emotions wheel that I was shown that I really love. It was put together by the Climate Mental Health Network. It's like a pie, and it's got all these little different rainbow colors, and each of them has a word. And I think there's 4 quadrants in the pie, and one of them is the hope space, like the optimism space. And I think when I feel that I'm in that space in relation to the world burning, it's because I'm among people who are working on it. I'm like with the activists, talking to them about what they're doing on the ground. And I think that is a good space in conversation with kids to enter into. Well, what's being done locally? I just wrote a lengthy essay about a brook in our neighborhood. We live in the Bronx. And New York City, like a lot of places, is on a lot of water that's been buried. So we live in a neighborhood that was marshland, and I didn't know that when we bought our house, but in fact it's sited on this buried river, and now it's being exhumed, and this has happened. It's a process in engineering terms some of you may know, called daylighting, where they're realizing we shouldn't have done that, actually. We really bungled the hydrology. And now that in our part of the world we're getting a lot more rain, we're getting a lot more flooding, we have to think about letting the water, thinking of that great Toni Morrison quote, another Toni Morrison concept about like water has a memory.
It has a memory. Yeah.
But how awesome that I get to tell my kids, like, look, there's this incredible local solution to a problem that's happening right down the block. It's been underway for 30 years. There are people from so many different agencies and in our neighborhood. And this was what Mr. Rogers meant when he said, like, during a crisis, it's really good to look for the helpers.
Yeah.
So in terms of talking to kids, I think, okay, what gives me hope is actually action, is being able to point to people who are doing things and saying, maybe there's ways we can connect with that, or amplify it, or celebrate it, so that we're not squashed by despair. But I also think it's okay to despair, as long as you don't linger there, because it calls for that. Looking at all those those fires and all the structures, the chimneys standing, like how can you not feel despair with the losses of people's homes and sense of rage?
And anger, is something that we allow in certain places in our society and don't allow in other places. We allow it in certain people and not in other people. But anger is something I think we have to all marshal now. And I don't know about you all, but I was sort of brought up to be, and I talk about this in my book a little, I was brought up by, a scholarly father and a very educated mother, and really not to be rude, to be polite and not to really argue, not to confront. Everyone was very non-confrontational and continues to be in my family. My own children, I didn't teach them manners. I failed to teach them manners in certain ways. My daughter acquired them on her own, but my son is like a feral child, And I think, but he also knows how to make bows out of trees he finds, and bows that work, and he knows to make a fire with just a bow drill, just something he makes himself out of wood, and so I think maybe the feral children are the future, and we should all be, raising more feral children.
Yeah, I'm glad to have these conversations about envisioning that the future is possible, because I think it is one of the, it's like the despair at what we see, like you were saying, I think it's inevitable. If you're a human being, I think you can't sort of look on certain things and, relentless optimism is a bit violent, actually. It's just kind of, but I think there's a difference between feeling despair in an empathetic way with what you see and abdicating hope. You know what I mean? Like there's, or not being mindful of the fact that a future is possible, which is essentially, maybe I've sort of boiled down, maybe I've lowered my bar or something too much, but sometimes I think that realistically, like hope is just like, is a future possible? And believing that a future is possible. But that seems to, I think that requires a lot of things. Like in a certain way, it also requires, it requires a great act of imagination, because certainly a future that looks like now is not possible. Even if it was possible in some sort of material way, it's not possible in any kind of other way. But something else, the sort of imagination about what the future might look like. There's a great thinker named Tina Kempt. And she has this beautiful essay in which she's talking about the future. She's talking about race and blackness in particular, but she comes up with this model that is so useful for everything. And she puts her idea of the future in almost like a grammarian. Like she uses something that she calls the future conditional tense, which is, and what she's trying to say is, what if we were to live in the now as if certain things were already real? And I thought that was really very beautiful, because it doesn't escape responsibility, and it's not a fantasy. It requires you to work towards that as if. But it's a very beautiful idea about a way to think about the future realistically, hopefully, but also like actionably.
Yeah, I think imagination is like, we talk about it, but it is always underrated consistently. Because we see that we're so stricken, we're so captivated and hypnotized by the world that is in front of us now, that we cannot believe that this world will be radically altered in 20 years or 40 years. We actually just can't believe it emotionally. We can rationally learn it, but we fail to translate that. But it is the case. It is the case. And so we have to imagine, what existence in that world will look like, and how maybe we can affect that now, that future now. But I really think we're just so overwhelmed by the daily small streams of information into our sensory sort of universe that we can't sort of fathom. And we need to imagine that.
And there's models of it all around us. Like, we all have them in our own lives. Like,
Yeah.
if you have children, I don't have children, but I certainly have people that I love. And I love them as if the world weren't on fire. You know? And people who have children are loving their children as if the world weren't burning. Like, and that act, you know, it's a great act to sort of, you know, you have to override something to love someone or something deeply and fiercely, even though you know that its destruction might be imminent. So we all have these models, I feel like, in our own lives and in our own families or whatever it is, these things that we love as if they weren't threatened. And there's something really, I don't know, it's like we have models for this in a certain sense. You know, back to the Toni Morrison thing, you know, these, in Beloved, you know, I mean, certainly she kills her children, but there's also there's also her mother-in-law who holds these sort of sermons in a field, and with all of these slaves who had escaped to the not anymore free state, but fugitive slave law means they can be taken at any moment. And she asked them to do things like hold up their hands, because those are their hands. And these are, you know, in a body that has been owned, for you to own the parts of your body is really quite something. The point being, like, she creates these communities of deep love over and against, and as if in the larger world, these people's bodies weren't chattel. And that's really, you know, there are endless powerful lessons in history about how to live as if, I think.
Yeah, you're reminding me, Ayana. I think I started writing about and thinking about mothering as an ethic of radical care that feels like an antidote, like a stance to really think about in relation to the climate crisis. When I was assigned to review this book, we're all critics as well as writers. I was assigned to review Elizabeth Rush's book, Rising, which some of you may know is finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and she was writing about sea level rise. And I kept thinking as I was reading the book, as a woman of mixed race, strangely or not so strangely, about my Black grandmother from Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, who in 1943, when her husband, my grandfather, was killed in a racially motivated hate crime, while my father was still in her womb, in utero, she had the fortitude to get out of the Jim Crow South. Like, the threat was so large. She took my two aunties and, you know, my dad in her womb, and she followed the path of the Great Migration that many people had taken before her to look for a better life where her children would not be so threatened. And the reason why I was thinking about her as a model was reading Elizabeth Rush's book, Rising, was that Elizabeth was writing about managed retreat in relation, specifically some cases of managed retreat, successful cases of managed retreat in Staten Island, in part of Louisiana, where people in their communities had gathered after a storm and realized, like, this storm is going to come again. I don't want to rebuild. I want to be sensible. We're going to seek local, state, and federal funds, get the pre-storm value of our homes, and move, in these cases she was writing about, together as a community. And she was writing about how we need increasingly, this was a few years ago, but it's more prescient than ever, we need to think about whether our communities are sustainable, how we're going to move as communities, and how we have to think about this in terms of politics and in even taxation, like who's going to foot the bill for all of this motion and migration that has to happen, and why this connected in my mind to the managed retreat that my grandmother had already taken under the terror of the Jim Crow South to keep her children safe, because she cared and loved them so much that she wanted to believe in a future. I had to write about those things in an interwoven way in a book review, and suddenly realizing, the ways that this crisis is intersectional are really interesting to me, and particularly the lens of motherhood. And yeah, like Lydia said, I'm not thinking about biological motherhood. I'm thinking about mothering as an ethic of wanting to believe in a future, wanting to think generations ahead. Like we don't say fathering and think the same way because of patriarchy, but I mean mothering in the sense of radical ethical care that feminists, Alexis Pauline Gumbs and Gloria Steinem wrote about it, right? Like we really need to think about care and nurture, to your nurturance, to your term earlier. What does it mean to love the future so deeply, to care for a child that is so threatened? But it looks like being really smart, and like sometimes it looks like when the waves are coming, like when guns are blazing, sometimes it looks like leaving, like not getting the hell out of Dodge. And knowing that you maybe can't rebuild where you are. Yeah. I think it's probably time for questions.
I think it is. I feel like we've had like a kind of like a seance or something.
If you have a question, please rise.
I'm wondering if you'd give us your thoughts on, with a country and a culture with so much information overload, that maybe our brains are not left with very much room for imagination to really think about what we would like our future to be.
I mean, I think that is a good assertion, as well as a question. I think that, we've never, just biologically, neurologically, we have never dealt with this overload, right? It's unprecedented in our history as a species, and I think that it is doing things we don't yet understand to our cognition and our emotional lives and our senses, and it's just it's tremendously important. And we also haven't, there's so much now, you used the word unprecedented, even though it's a wonky, dull word in certain ways.
Still sometimes it's...
But there's so much happening now, really, that really hasn't happened before. And people like to sort of sometimes dismiss that, like X, Y, Z has happened in history. There are always, doomsayers. But in fact, there is so much that is novel now. And along with that sort of crazy information overload, there's also the fact that we're sort of reducing the use of many of our senses. And so we use our eyes, right, to consume that information mostly, and sometimes our ears. The other senses are being sort of neglected in our relationship to the world. We sit in boxes, we look at boxes, everything's in a frame, everything's prepared for us, everything's curated. And when it's not, we're stultified. We're just thrown for a loop. But anyway, I'm going to give. I could actually go on so long about that question. So I want you guys to also speak to it.
I'm not sure I have anything to add, except at least in my own work. I called my book Lessons for Survival because I really struggle myself with maintaining an imagination, I guess feelings of hope or knowing what to do. And yet I think, when we look to history and when we look to historically resilient communities, there are a lot of lessons that can help us. And that was why I wanted to look to the past and thinking about my grandmother's strength, thinking about these Yupik people who are not dead. I also went to Palestine and interviewed indigenous people there. I was trying to collect wisdom about survival through insurmountable odds and existential threats. And so I think, yes, it is hard to maintain imagination and hope. And also, there are some people who have a lot of wisdom about that.
Yeah, I don't have much. I guess the last thing I would say is that I don't think we can expect it to be easy. Like, that's the thing. Not, and what I mean, I don't mean that it's not going to be easy to survive the climate crisis. Like, obviously that's not going to be easy. But I mean, but even reconnecting with the sense of if it feels as though there's these sort of disconnects to things like your imaginative self or imaginative possibilities, like that reconnection isn't going to be easy. You know, like today, just to be completely honest, my mother died about 1.5 years ago. I'm an only child, and she was most of my family. I'm completely in grief. I'm totally despairing. So, like, I often, like, today I feel okay, like, for this hour. In 2 hours, I'll be totally despairing again. I won't feel particularly plugged into the futuristic future tense of the as is. I'll just feel like hell. But that, at the same time, it's a process, right? Like, so sometimes it's a process that's just not working and miserable, and then sometimes it isn't. But I think also we get a little conditioned to think that there are I don't know, these kind of strategies that we can do, you know, and we can do, and that'll ease it. But in some ways, it's uncomfortable to have imagination again after you haven't. You know, it's like if you've been outside in the cold for too long. This may be a weird thing to say to a room full of Floridians, but like if it's really, really, really cold, you know, and you kind of get numb a little bit, and then you come back inside, and it's not just that the feeling returns to your fingers, it hurts. Like your fingers hurt when the blood kind of comes back into them. But that's how you keep the fingers, right? So I don't know. It's sort of a weird analogy, but I guess the point is like we can expect some discomfort along the way, but maybe that's okay. Maybe that's better than not feeling anything.
We can avoid it anyway.
Right. I was going to say just one more thing about that, which is that since we're here to talk about stories and writers and storytelling, and I think, you know, we really have to, the culture desperately has to tell different kinds of stories. And I actually think both these writers are, you know, attempting that. We've had all these stories that are just about the self, and we continue to just churn out these like epics about heroic selves, and to look to Hollywood movies that feature, you know, always the I, always the lone person, and really that's not the world. That's not reality. One of the things that makes us interesting and distinctive among the other creatures that live here is our sociability, right? That's how we survived originally, a long time ago. We are social in unique and interesting ways, and we have to go back to that. We have to tell stories about community, and that's how I think we can imagine better how to cope. Stories not just about the self, but about the collective. And they're hard to tell. It's hard to write those stories. But on the other hand, like indigenous cultures have written and told, well, not written, told and then written, told stories for many, many hundreds of years, millennia, that are far more collective than the ones we tell in this dominant culture. And maybe we should look to that more.
We have time for one more.
My bad.
Hi, thank you. So in terms of mothering while the world is burning, and also understanding that women go through different phases of their life. There's the phase that we are mothering the children, and then we go through menopause and we move into the wise woman phase and the grandmother. And I would just love to hear your perspective as our roles as we're mothering in these different phases of our lives.
Just to tie it to what Lydia just said about perhaps the need for more communal stories, and tying it to what you've just asked about the space for the wisdom of women who are in a different phase of life, right? Like a different level of wisdom to offer. I don't know, it just invites me to think as a writer about allotting space for a lot of voices. One piece of writing I really enjoyed doing that I didn't even understand was an essay. I'm not even sure that's what it was. Was like a collective, almost like a chorus. I felt invited by or challenged by, felt like a gauntlet had been thrown down by this climate scientist named Catherine Hayhoe, who claims that one of the best things we can do as individuals to combat the climate crisis, even though we really need to not be thinking individualistically, is just talking about it. And this seemed like a sort of radical idea a few years ago. I think a lot of us are talking about it a lot more than we used to, but there's still this gap called climate silence between the number of us who are appropriately concerned and the number of us who are talking about it with any degree of regularity, if at all. And when she said that, I thought, well, let me start talking about it with everybody all the time and then collecting what they're saying. And my question for people in my community was, how are you feeling the effects of the climate crisis in your body and in your local habitat? I just started writing down what they were saying and then putting them together in this thing that wound up being very long, and it made space for like the voices of wise women, as well as the voices of children, as well as the voices of mothers, as well as the voices of people who are mothering, who are not mothers, as well as the people who are so frightened of the future that they don't feel it's ethical to have children. And when you weave enough of those voices together in a tapestry, I think it offers a different kind of story about where we're at and perhaps where we want to go. Anyone else? On wise women phase?
I think you've said it well.
Yeah, indeed.
Thank you all.